To kick us off, Diane Foley, president and founder of the James W. Foley Legacy Foundation, who will deliver some opening remarks.
Today, September 18th, marks 2 years since the release of Semak Namazi, Morad Tabaz, and Imad Sharji from their wrongful detention in Iran. We are so deeply grateful to be reunited with their families. Their homecomings remind us of what is possible when our government acts with urgency and moral clarity. Today, we formally present the Foley Foundation's 2025 Bringing Americans Home report. As Benjamin said, it's our 7th year of independent, nonpartisan research, and it reflects the final year of the Biden administration. It comes at a pivotal moment, early in President Trump's second term, when we believe there's a real opportunity to resolve long-standing challenges and strengthen our national response to hostage-taking and wrongful detention. Since 2015, the United States has shown moral courage in prioritizing the safe return of U.S. nationals unjustly held by foreign actors simply because they're American. We applaud that progress. More than 170 Americans have been freed, a legacy born of the sacrifice of many brave Americans, including our son Jim and others like Robert Levinson, journalist Luke Summers, and Stephen Sotloff, aid workers Kayla Mueller and Peter Kassig, and businessman Warren Weinstein. But the threat has evolved. Wrongful detention now accounts for the vast majority of known cases. It is no longer just a humanitarian issue. It is now a national security crisis. Any American traveling abroad can be used by nefarious actors as a pawn to influence U.S. policy. And that is why the Foley Foundation is calling for a comprehensive review of the U.S. hostage enterprise, one that includes government and non-government experts, victim input, and a clear focus on deterrence and prevention. As I wrote in the report, we must summon the moral courage to fully confront this threat, deter it, and prevent it, while continuing to prioritize the safety of all Americans abroad. All citizens unjustly held captive deserve to know that their government will never again abandon them. This report identifies persistent structural challenges that have left Americans in captivity longer than necessary. It outlines reforms to speed their return, better support their families, and ensure that our government has the tools and strategies not just to react, but to end the abuse of this human rights crisis. We are honored to be joined today by a panel of experts and victims who will discuss the report's findings and recommendations. I want to sincerely thank all of you for your commitment to this mission. Together, we can bring more Americans home. Together, we can prevent others from being taken. And together, we can ensure that our nation never turns away those most in need of our help. Thank you. And now I'm very proud to introduce the Foley Foundation's Director of Hostage Advocacy and Research, Liz Richards, who will provide an overview of the report's findings and recommendations. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Diane. We appreciate it. Thank you very much, Diane. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you for everyone who turned in today to discuss this important issue. We really appreciate it. So we will do a quick overview of the current hostage enterprise before moving into our methodology for the current report that was released today, and then discussing the findings, recommendations, and our conclusions based on what we heard. So as you know, 2015 represents it's an important year for our community because it marks 10 years of the hostage enterprise. And we open our report with a review of its evolution. A special thanks to our undergraduate interns who worked on that section of this report. We really wanted to make sure that we were highlighting where we had been with the U.S. hostage enterprise, so we can think about where we go next. Of note, because President Trump signed the executive order strengthening efforts to protect U.S. nationals from wrongful detention abroad on September 5th of this month. And that is an important tool of the deterrence. And the only reason it's not inflected in the intro to our report is because we sent the final copy of the report to the printers the day before that executive order was signed. So as we look back on where we have been, we want anyone reading the report to think about where we go next. So for this report, the information in the report is based on a series of semi-structured interviews that we did with 35 people, and that is with family members, both of current families whose loved ones currently being wrongfully held somewhere in the world, or family members whose loved one has returned within the last 2 years. That's with U.S. government officials and with subject matter experts. And as Diane said, the information based on when we collected the data really reflects like the final years of the Biden administration. So an overview, we had 7 main findings from this report, and they represent the structural challenges that lead to inefficiencies and delay Americans coming home faster. They represent gaps in some of the current laws and policies that we have, and also identified barriers and struggles that families, when they're experiencing a hostage event or a wrongful detention experience, and where we could do better in providing support to them. So looking a little deeper at these findings, our main finding for this report is that structural inefficiencies delayed Americans from coming home faster. We heard this from U.S. government officials, subject matter experts, and family members. So when we look at it, what we heard again and again was that the individuals charged with bringing Americans home within the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs Office and the members of the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell are not sufficiently empowered to do their jobs. And the way that manifests was in many different ways. It was in lack of access at times to top decision makers, including the President of the United States. It's in lack of funding at times and making sure that the organizations have the proper manning and resources to do their jobs. We also heard about competing priorities, particularly I think at the National Security Council level, when we're competing against where this issue about bringing Americans home at times might run against other portfolios and foreign policy concerns, and the role that played in delaying decision-making to bring Americans home. And we heard from one subject matter expert and a family as well about how sometimes the multiple players in this space can create a little confusion at times, and how not having a single voice on hostage or wrongful detention matters can make this space confusing to navigate. So as we looked at this information and thought about what could be done to overcome these barriers, that's where we get the recommendations. And first, I think one that the Congress needs to do is dedicating annual funding to the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. This has been a repeat finding from the Foley Foundation's Bringing Americans Home research series. And it's about time that this is accomplished, to make sure, again, that the people charged with bringing Americans home are actually properly resourced to do that job. We also need to make sure there are policies in place, and it's very clear from the top down that to ensure that negotiations to free Americans are insulated from other foreign policy concerns. And finally, and we think that our main recommendation, doing a whole of government review that actually looks at how the U.S. hostage enterprise is going. As you heard from Diane, we've been doing this now for 10 years. During this time, there has not been a review. The Foley Foundation has done this annual exercise, but we recognize that we do not have access to all the information. And as we heard from one government official, the time is ripe now early into a new administration to do a review. We say this though, and stress that this should not be a cost-cutting exercise. We really stress a do no harm type of mentality when doing any type of review. But we do think that, especially with seeing some of the repeat issues that we do year after year with this report, that this would be a good time to start to do a review and start addressing some of those long-standing issues and make sure we're bringing Americans home, and we're bringing Americans home faster. As we moving into some of the policies that we found that there are still some gaps or misunderstandings. For the 11th Act criteria not being binding, I want to make sure I'm being fair to the fair. When we talk to U.S. government employees, all U.S. government employees we asked about the Levinson Act did say the Levinson Act was the basis for their decision making. And we still think it is noteworthy that last fall, the Department of Justice issued a formal opinion in the motion to dismiss a lawsuit in which the Department of Justice stressed that the Levinson Act outlines factors, not criteria, and that those factors are meant more as guidelines and are not seen as binding. In talking with U.S. government officials too, to understand the totality of circumstances, a phrase you'll find in the Levinson Act, and a phrase that, frankly, when we talk to families, is often families are often told that their loved one will not be designated as wrongfully detained at a time based on the totality of circumstances. We have the understanding now that totality of circumstances is meant to provide the Secretary of State with flexibility. And we would like to see that flexibility expand the umbrella of individuals who are designated as wrongfully detained instead of constricting it. Again, to be fair to the U.S. government, in discussing these findings with some officials, I heard that totality of circumstances, in their view, is used to increase those designated at times, and that may be true. But again, in talking with families, what we hear is that that is not the majority's experiences when they hear that phrase. And similar to the last finding, again, we heard about the role that bilateral concerns or other foreign policy concerns influencing designation decisions. Now, this wasn't unanimous when we asked officials. Some were very adamant that bilateral concerns did not influence their decision-making or their office's decision-makings. But we heard other officials talk about the role that bilateral relationships and bilateral concerns did play in designation decisions at times. So that's where, again, we think more guidance around these areas to stress and separate this issue from foreign policy concerns could be useful. Again, in looking at the Levinson Act covers all U.S. nationals, including legal permanent residents. However, in our interviews, we did have one government official talk about their view that sometimes LPRs, legal permanent residents, might not have the same treatment as a U.S. citizen because consular's mandate is U.S. citizens, and consular does not have oversight of cases that involve an LPR. And consular affairs is where, in most cases, a wrongful detention is going to start in that consular service. And we recognize there are issues with the captor countries in cases involving LPRs, and we still think this is an area for more attention with regards to how our government treats and responds to cases where a legal permanent resident is being unjustly held. With the Levinson Act, again, as we were looking at the Levinson Act, we identified that exit bans are not covered by the Levinson Act and identified this as a gap. Exit bans are not viewed as a wrongful detention and cannot, under international law, cannot be designated as a wrongful detention. However, we know that certain countries, such as China, weaponize exit bans as a means of state control. And we really want to see our government be able to have all the power resources to address these abusive and coercive exit bans, and amending the Levinson Act to include wrongful exit bans where appropriate, we think would be a good legislative fix. Again, the designation process continues to lack transparency. This is a repeat finding again from the research that we do. We know the State Department likes to keep their processes internal, but some of the issues with that could be the lack of tracking, the lack of timeliness in responses, and a lot of questions around how does a family actually engage the State Department when their loved one is being held, and the family wants to know that their loved one's case is being evaluated against the Levinson criteria. And in terms of family support, we did not ask any questions specific to regarding finances, but as we listened to families, this idea of money and how much a family has to spend when a loved one is being unjustly held kept coming up in the conversations. And besides just the legal expenses, travel expenses, there could be additional complications if a power attorney isn't already in place, and trying to get a family member listed onto a rental agreement or getting access to a bank account. And the process of going through and trying to set up a conservatorship can be extremely challenging at times. And there's also this idea in all of this of equity. Several families shared that they fear they lack the resources to properly advocate for their loved one. So to address some of this, like the government of Israel actually has a really good model to take care of families during the hostage event and then post recovery as well. We think our government looking at that model and seeing how we could come up with something similar to that model would be good. And making sure we're addressing those perceived inequalities as well. And I really think if we're addressing some of the issues with the lack of transparency around the designation and who we bring home, we can build up more trust with the U.S. government can build up more trust with families. And the final finding of our report, this was not one I was expecting to find, but when we asked families where they felt they had their greatest success in the past year advocating for their loved one, the majority of families, both current and former or return families, spoke about their advisor or the advocacy the support they received during this. Maybe a little less surprising, we also heard the important role of trusted advisors in this space from subject matter experts as well. Subject matter experts, some of them themselves are advisors, and talked about how the advisors help families navigate this space. But what we heard from subject matter experts, they were more likely to actually warn about actors who might seek to exploit families in this area, especially charging exorbitant fees for their services. So we started with this report with the idea of where we've been, and we want to think about where we're going. The quote you see on this slide, that the biggest thing we need to do is speed up the process and increase support to families, really sums up and captures that sentiment. Our main finding that if there's one thing we want people reading this report and walking away knowing, is that Americans remained in captivity longer, sometimes not because of the actions of the captor country, but because of inefficiencies within our own government. We also noted that some of these findings and recommendations are longstanding, adding to our call for a review. When I was in the Air Force, after a major exercise, we would conduct an after-action review to capture lessons learned. I remember saying that we wanted to make sure we were improving every time and that these really were lessons learned and not just lessons observed, problems that would come up the same time next year when we did the same exercise again. So based on the findings laid out today, the Foley Foundation assesses the way we move forward best and make real progress in this area is to do a review and implement the changes to repeated findings set out in this report.
Very quickly, I'll introduce Peter Bergen, who is the moderator of today's panel. Peter is a distinguished journalist, and Peter is currently serving as Vice President, Global Studies and Fellows at New America Foundation, He's also a professor of practice at Arizona State University. So I'm going to bring Peter on screen as well as the other panelists whom Peter is going to introduce. Turn it over to you now, Peter.
Thank you. So we're joined by Elizabeth Richards, who you've just heard from, who is the Director of Research at the Foley Foundation and the lead pen on this report, Mickey Bergman, who's the CEO of Global Reach, and Alexandra Glucksman, who is the spouse of George, who was held by the Taliban for 840 days. So let me ask a question to each of you about the top finding of the report, which is that Americans are spending more time in captivity due to structural inefficiencies in the U.S. response. Maybe I'll start with you, Mickey.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Liz, for the report, and Diane and Benjamin, of course, for all the work that Foley Foundation is doing. I want to acknowledge something as we start. The work that Liz has done on this report reflects a lot moving back through the previous administration and into early this administration. And by acknowledging that, I'm not trying to poke a hole in the findings. Quite the opposite. I think that the findings and what Liz has done in this report and showing what is consistent over the years is something really important. At the same time, we want to acknowledge that different administrations have different tacks on things, and they're more their approaches are very, very different. We had a previous administration under the Biden administration that was more focused on processes and trying to put an organization behind it, and that had its strengths and its weaknesses. And we have a current administration under President Trump that is much, much less constrained by processes and is much more reactive to the situations on the ground. That means that this current administration is taking more risks, is willing to take more risks. It is not bound by bureaucracies. And it's not even bound necessarily by the strict definition of who is designated and who is not. And I'm not saying this all as a plus. There is weaknesses and strength in each of these approaches. It is proving, from a pragmatic standpoint, to be bringing a lot of people home relatively quickly. And I think anybody who's looking at the numbers have to be honest and say, look, the numbers are talking. People are coming home. At the same time, the longevity of the report and the findings of it is extremely relevant, because those trends that have been identified are going to continue, and we have to look at it. So I think if we look at numbers, Peter, to your question, we're seeing a lot of Americans coming home, but we're also seeing a development of some trends that are worrying. And I think Diane has talked about it before, of numbers going up in the categories and the different ways that Americans are being held, either in captivity or in travel bans. And that's something that we have to continue to address within the advocacy of this work.
Thank you, Mickey. Alexandra, can you tell us what happened to your husband and kind of how the U.S. government dealt with it?
Hello all. As many of you already know, my husband was wrongfully detained by the Taliban in Afghanistan for 840 days. It took us about 1 year to designate him as wrongfully detained. It was a 2-year-long nightmare for myself and my family. I felt that there was a lot of ways in which Biden's administration failed us, and I feel that I gained a lot of experience that I never wished for, and I would really like to share this experience now with other families, and I hope it really helps. Also, Elizabeth, I just wanted to say, amazing research. I think you touched a lot of very important topics, especially a lot of problems that I personally went through, especially legal issues, conservatorship. So thank you, really thank you for addressing these issues. I think they're really helpful.
Alexandra.
Thank you for being.
Okay, go ahead, Liz.
I was just going to thank you for being here today and sharing those experiences. We find the stories from families are the most impactful, especially in generating change.
Alexander, can I ask you a question about this wrongful designation? So for those who may not understand this completely, the State Department has a formal process to designate somebody as being wrongfully detained by a state. Now, was it complicated in the Biden administration's mind by the fact that the Taliban is not a government that's recognized by any government except until recently Russia, and it's certainly not recognized by the US government? So was part of their argument that if we assign a wrongful detention category to your husband, it's a form of recognition that the Taliban are the government? I know that's legalistic, but was that their argument?
Absolutely, that was the argument. And at some point I felt maybe it was an excuse for George not being a priority because we were dealing with Afghanistan, and you know how sensitive Biden's administration was when it came to the Afghanistan topic in general. So at some point I even felt that it was an excuse why George was not being designated for such a long time. But yes, this argument, I've heard it many times, and I don't know, in the end, it was a miracle, so he was designated. Another issue that I would like to bring up, the concept of, wrongful detention. Initially, when George was detained, we dealt with the consular affairs unit, and I was never really told about the possibility of being designated as wrongfully detained. So it took several months before I even knew about this option. So I think there was also a time lost there because I could not press, for George being designated.
And when you say consular, presumably the consular office was in Pakistan, right?
No, consular office within the State Department, because initially when my husband went missing and I reported him missing, it was not the SPIHA office who dealt with our case, it was the consular affairs. And I felt that there was a lot of gaps that, in communication and in general in providing information and recommendations, or even sharing information about the resources out there that I could have used.
And what finally, when your husband was released, what do you attribute that to?
I do attribute it to, of course, President Trump, completely changing his policies regarding hostage taking and the way he dealt with, especially with our situation. I attribute it to that, absolutely.
What was the difference?
Everything was different. Everything. The way I was treated was different. I just cannot tell you how different. I remember, going for a meeting with National Security Advisor Sullivan, and then with a new advisor. And in first case, I was I was basically told by the National Security Advisor that he would not tolerate me, bullying his office, and it was regarding, some media statements that I made, and the way I was welcomed and treated by the new NSA, it was just, a completely different story. I felt like George was a priority. The first time I felt that he was a priority, and I really knew that he would be released just from the first weeks of President Trump's administration. Just the way the case was developing, all the communication I had with new SPIHA, I knew George would be out within months.
Peter, can I jump in on something? Because Alexandra, you said something really, really important here. To understand when it comes to designation, it's one of Liz's biggest findings in the report. We need to understand, all of us, when a family, when the Levinson Act was put into place, which is an extremely a big achievement for us and established this designation and the criteria of it, it also came with a weakness that we might have not seen at the beginning. And that is that according to the law and according to the practice of the US government, if you pass the threshold and you've been designated, now you have advocacy inside the US government that works to bring your loved one back home. However, if you don't pass this threshold, there's nobody really that is there to advocate for your loved one release. And that means, as Alexandra is telling from our experience, the consular officers, they're not mandated by the US government and their job to bring somebody home. They're mandated to take care of wellness and due process. And that part, that line in the sand is critical. And what we've seen, and I think if I'm interpreting a little bit what Alexandra was saying, her feeling into the practice, because we're in the practice of it, what she saw is that in the current administration, they came in and said, we are not necessarily married to these designations. We're able to expand them informally beyond what the law is, or restrict them at times. But the point is that the special presidential envoy, Adam Boehler, with his mandate from his boss, the president, has gotten people out before they were designated, people who were not designated, and in some cases, and I believe in the case of George, was designated eventually. There is, again, it's a really good thing and a comforting thing for the families that never got the designation to know that in the current administration, they're still working on bringing their loved ones home, but there are real costs for not being designated for the family when it comes to the support they're getting, to the answers they're getting, to the clarity from government that they're getting. And that is something that we need to address together as an enterprise, as a collection of activists, of former hostages, their families, the advocacy groups like the Foley Foundation, to fix and to work, because there's a reason why we need to have those laws, and we need to keep them with the intention that they've been legislated.
Liz, I had a couple of questions. One, I think this is the first Foley Foundation report that mentions the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as wrongfully detaining folks. I'm sure that's not the US government view from a kind of technical legal point of view, since these wrongful detentions tend to be assigned to countries that we have poor relations with, like Iran, China, and Russia. But the fact is, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is holding Americans indefinitely with no charges. And I mean, I think it's a welcome development that you're highlighting this in this report. And on the subject of exit bans, you mentioned China. Well, Saudi Arabia also engages in this, as do other countries, I believe, in the Gulf. And so why did you include Saudi Arabia? And can you sort of expand a little bit on what exit bans are in practice?
Sure. No, thank you, Peter, for bringing this up. So again, and to be clear, I don't believe anyone we talked to for the purposes of this report brought up exit bans themselves, but we were taking a deeper look at the Levinson Act, just because when we talked to people, especially government officials, about it, they really helped me understand how important the Levinson Act was and the evolution of the enterprise and the way forward. And as we were looking at the Levinson Act and the cases that we here at the Foley Foundation help advocate for, realizing like exit bans aren't covered, as you say, in the Levinson Act. And an exit ban prevents someone from leaving the country. They may or may not have some freedom of movement within the country, but they might. But more often in practice, the harassment, or what we see and what we hear from loved ones and from families, is that individual is still being harassed, even if they're technically not detained. They're not free to leave. They're still getting pulled in at times, either for court processes or for additional interrogations. They're still being harassed. If they have family and country, there's the additional fear that family could be harassed. Again, we want to be clear, when the Foley Foundation, when we say what 40 cases that we're tracking, we do count exit bans in that. And as we try and make clear in this report, we know the U.S. government does not consider exit bans as a form of wrongful detention because of international law. And what I remember talking with some consular affairs officers about this, and they really helped me understand it, and about the implications of like the U.S. government calling an exit ban a form of detention, the implications it would have for the U.S. government's own exit bans within our country. So we understand that, and we still know there are bad actors out there that misuse exit bans, and that exit bans should still at times be considered wrongful and be able to be designated under the Levinson Act.
Liz, can I ask you on that quick? So you said there's some sort of implications for our own laws. What do you mean for US laws?
where the United States has individuals placed on exit bans within our own borders.
And
And I am
typically,
not a
who are
lawyer. I am not a lawyer. This was
Mm.
just like conversations to make sure that when we put forward these recommendations, we are putting them forward in the best way. Because I asked the State Department why we just can't call exit bans a form of detention, and that was what we talked through. Because again, we would see them as a form of detention legally. Been explained many times to me that we can't call them detention because the individual is not imprisoned, and it's based on international law.
Alexandra, switching gears a bit, the report talks about the significant financial burdens families face. Can you speak about some of your own experiences and the report's recommendations of the stipend that Liz mentioned in the opening, or a path to conservatorship, which I am not sure exactly what that means, but can you reflect on your own experiences and kind of how they might be, how it could have been better?
Yes, of course, financial burden was a big part of my experience in the past 2 years. When basically George was the sole provider in our family, as I was still going through my certification at the time. He went missing. And also he was also taking care of my mother, who was going through chemo treatment. So, with George missing, we suffered terribly. The main problem was that, our condominium was listed under both of our names. Also, we had some accounts where, even though it was shared accounts, but I still had some issues accessing our funds. I was not able to sell our condominium because George did not leave the power of attorney, and I did not even know how to approach this problem. Unfortunately, at that time, ChatGPT was not a big thing 3 years ago, and I had to be asking people around, my real estate agent, attorneys, on how could I resolve this situation. I did not receive any clear advice from the State Department at that time, because, as I told you initially, I was dealing with the consular affairs at the State Department. And that it just happened that I've heard somewhere that there is such a legal concept as conservatorship, and it could be applied to people that are wrongfully detained, which is not a common practice and not something that even many attorneys know about. But I was lucky to learn that this was one of my options. So basically, conservatorship is like it's a legal term that could apply to a person that is physically or mentally incapacitated. Let's say you have a person that is in coma, or a person with mental issues that cannot make his or her own decisions, financial decisions mostly. And then you apply for a conservatorship, and you become a conservator, and you make decisions on that person's behalf. As you can imagine, the criteria that you have to meet to qualify for the status, it's completely different, and you cannot apply this criteria to a person that is overseas, missing, or been held hostage, or been wrongfully detained. It's just it's completely different situations. So to tailor this legal concept into wrongful detention is just extremely difficult. Just to give you an example, normally to obtain conservatorship, emergency conservatorship, it takes 30 days. It took me about a year to receive conservatorship. And even after that, once the court told me, okay, now you're a conservator, and yes, you can act on George's behalf, every single time I had to make decision, I had to, place another new petition. For example, if I wanted to sell a condominium or a car, every single time I had to ask permission to a court, and that stretched the entire process even more. So just to for you to imagine, it took me about a year and a half to be able to even, legally sell our condominium. In the meantime, it was very difficult for me to pay a mortgage. And then you have all these, trips that you have to take to Washington, D.C. And here I would like to say, thank God for organizations such as Foley Foundation, Hostage US. If not Hostage US, I probably wouldn't have been able to travel that often as I did to to Washington, D.C. because they covered the travel expenses, accommodations, and so on. But I would not have done without them. So it was a really difficult experience financially. Even our own assets, I had no access to, let alone getting a job, which probably is impossible. I was living overseas at the time, so all the phone calls, video calls with the State Department was basically happening at late night, night phone calls. So I had to stay up very often. So you can imagine, I mean, you don't really have a normal life. You cannot have a normal job to support yourself. And then all these psychological issues that you're going through when your loved one is held hostage. So yeah, I
How's
think
your
it's a
family
very-
doing now?
My family is doing well. My mom is still sick, but we are able to take care of her, and I think we are doing much better now that George is up. Thank God.
Mickey, the report talks about third-party advisors playing a crucial role, and of course, you've been doing this for a very long time as a third-party advisor. The report also says that some, I guess, sometimes people get approached, for a certain amount of money, they can sort this out or whatever. So, I mean, tell us a little bit about how you act as a third-party advisor, and you're quite well known in the space. I imagine a simple Google search would bring you up pretty quickly if you were a family that was in this situation. How do you operate, and how do you distinguish yourselves from people who are not acting ethically?
Thank you. And that is actually a really, really important thing for us to do with Global Reach, the organization that I'm working for. The first thing to state very clearly, we are a non-for-profit, non-government organization. We would never, ever charge a dime of a family, nor will we accept donations from a family even after somebody comes home. That is a very big thing for us. And the spaces, you mentioned people that approach families and say, oh, if you just give that money and we can have it resolved. We have extortions from the countries that Americans are being held. And we have Americans, as you can imagine, families paying tens of thousands of dollars for that. That's one category. That's extortion. That's not even talking about advisors in the United States or law firms and individuals who would go and solicit funds from families, arguing with them that they can help them. We believe that there's enough resources out there that nobody should be charging a family for any of the services that are being conducted. There are, of course, specific exemptions when it comes to media, ads, and stuff like that cost money. But even that, at least from our case, we're able to find ways to do it without the families' cost. Foley Foundation would never take money from families. Hostage US, that helped Alexandra so much, would never take money from families, and that is really, really important for us to distinguish. To your question, what we do when we get approached by a family, and it's important too, we don't proactively approach families because we believe that when they're thrown into this mix, everybody and their sister is approaching these families, everybody with the best intentions. They want to help, but very few know what they're doing. But the family is so overwhelmed with misinformation and partial information. And the burden on the shoulders of that family, when Alexandra would find out the first time, breaking news about George being taken, every single decision that she had to make might have been the decision that would get him home or will cost him his life or months or years of his life. And that is an impossible burden. So we try not to add to that. Typically, families come to us because they've heard from the congressional representation, or from the Foley Foundation, or the U.S. government itself. And we coordinate very closely with the Foley Foundation on these cases as a part of our intake to make sure that we understand what the circumstances are of the case. And then we develop what we refer to as the theory of return, which is the script or the pathway, the shortest story we can tell ourselves of how that person comes home. And then we have our own in-house capabilities whether it's in mediation and negotiation directly with the captors, whether it is engagement with the US government, specifically in the different elements of the US government and how pieces needs to be put in place, whether it's investigative and intelligence gathering, both digital and human, when we need to do that, and whether it is the media training for the family and a media strategy for the family, because you don't do media just for the sake of appearing in the media, you do it if it supports the theory of return. And that's how we work on these things. We partner a lot with other advocates and advisors out there on cases, and we've been we've seen the results coming out this year as a part of the new administration, and our ability to work with them actually pretty well. In cases that we've seen in Venezuela that was famous or public, the Gaza interim agreement that got the Americans out, even though we still have remains of Americans held in Gaza. Russia returns, but I have to say, it's important to know, even, I'm sitting here with Alexandra and George is back from Afghanistan. As we're sitting here, there are 4 Americans that are being held, and there's still answers that we owed about Paul Overby over there. One of these Americans is Mahmoud Habibi, and they need to come home. In Russia, we had returns, really good returns from this administration from Russia, but we still have Americans. Andrei Khachaturian is still held. David Barnes is still held over there. Robert Gilman is still held, and Olga Jesler is still held. And all of them, one of the things that is important, government can never match the sense of urgency that the family feels. Just before this, we talked about how lucky George was that he got out in time, because every single day that they are there, something might happen. Health issues, mental health issues, a physical attack on them, or disease. So many things can go wrong, and that sense of urgency that the family feels cannot be matched by government, but we really need to acknowledge that gap.
Mickey, two or three other quick questions. One, so the 20 the hostages that are being held by Hamas or Islamic Jihad, there are 20 left. Are there any American citizens or dual nationals in that group?
Not amongst the living, but yes, amongst main. So the confirmed hostages that were killed by Hamas, and Itai Chen is one of them, one of the big names, American. There are others, and they need to come home. And it's a part of, one of the biggest things, and I actually give a lot of credit to this administration. They're not leaving it only to the Israelis and the Israeli Prime Minister to do it. It is the mission and the objective and the responsibility of the President of the United States to take care of his own constituents. And returning of remains is a critical mission on that, and they are heavily involved in this and trying to solve this, and it's a complicated one to solve.
A couple of other quick questions. One, and you know this very well, each of these situations, hostage situations, is quite different. I mean, in the sense that being held by the Taliban presents a whole set of issues that may be different than if you're being held by the Russians or the Iranians. So how do you, as a negotiator, sort of negotiate the fact that what works in Venezuela probably is not going to work in Afghanistan?
Yeah, we do. Our theories of returns are very diverse. We have whiteboards all over here. Some of them are very creative, some of them are more traditional. But one of the major things that we do, because we're not government, we don't have the authority of government. We can't negotiate for the release of prisoners here. We can advocate for that if we know that brings Americans home. We rely a lot on relationships. And most of our conversations are about individuals, not only countries, but individuals in the leadership in those countries. How do we engage with them? How do we get them what it is that they might be looking for? As you can imagine, a lot of these entities and governments and individuals would not come and say out loud to you straight out what it is that they want. It requires a relationship that you need to build over time. And the unspoken part of our work is that engagement. And we do that over the years. We don't do it only when we have crisis. We engage with some of those countries and some of those governments that the US has problems with on the bilateral, or to improve hopefully the conditions, but also for the sake of when we need intervention, we have a relationship that we can build on. Governor Richardson, who I used to work with for 17 years until he passed away at the Richardson Center before we established Global Reach, which was after he died, he came in with that network because he's been doing it for decades before, and he knew them, and he used to love joking that authoritarian regimes the same people tend to stay for a long time, so it's a good investment in relationships. Without him, we have collected amongst us, because we don't have a new Richardson, what we have is a collective of American leaders, former officials, former diplomats, who have these relationships to a certain extent ad hoc in cases, and we deploy them and we use them and we build on that, and we do a lot of engagement projects in order to keep building that network.
Liz, returning to your report for a minute, are dual nationals more likely to be taken by a regime that sort of sees them not as Americans, but let's say as Iranians, or is that not an issue?
We didn't look at specifically those statistics. We do know that dual nationals are at risk. We do know countries like Russia, China do not recognize dual citizenship, and the problems that causes at times with the U.S. Embassy getting access to U.S. nationals who hold that dual citizenship. And we know some of those issues when we engage with the U.S. government on issues of dual nationals and LPRs. We sometimes hear back, like, because we talk about LPRs in this case and highlight the case of Olga Jesler that Mickey mentioned, dual Russian national, and she would have been a U.S. Citizen by now if she hadn't been held in Russia for so long. The U.S. Embassy actually getting access to her, we know captor countries don't always honor that citizenship.
Alexandra, is there anything that you'd like to add as we begin to wind up here?
Well, in my case, George was a citizen at that time, so I don't really have an experience. So I don't know how the government would have treated us if George was a green card holder. So I don't think I can add anything.
Nikki, any final thoughts?
Yes, if I may, two things. One is regarding deterrence, and Liz has talked about it in her report. We have the executive order now of designation of states supporting of wrongful detention. Just like the Levinson Act, it is a really, really important executive order as a part of the detention of the deterrence. I believe Adam Boller has been using it fantastically well to begin with, in getting some Americans home with the threat of these countries not wanting to get entangled in this. And as I said before, everything it can be a double-edged sword. We need to make sure that it keeps getting used with the intention that it was made for, and not starting piling on. And that gets into the point that I want to say. We have to make sure that this work does not become partisan. Every now and then we'll see some statements and punching off each other. This is an American problem, and it's an American solution. It cannot be partisan, and it's something that we have to stay with. The second point, if I may, and again highlighted very well by Liz in the report and in this presentation, the issue of the permanent residents. That's an issue we need to address, and unfortunately it's entangled because of politics with other issues of permanent residency inside the US. We need to separate that. This is not what we're talking about here, but we're talking about legal permanent residents of the United States that by constitution are American persons. And when those get entangled abroad and get detained, they have to be treated as American persons per their rights on the Constitution, and not be challenged and questioned whether they're American enough. And that is something that we, as the enterprise here, need to work with our partners in government to help make sure that we keep that insulated from whatever domestic politics conversations might exist, and into the fact that these are American persons and they have to come back. So I commend Liz and the Foley Foundation for highlighting it's a potentially painful issue to deal with, a nuanced one, but we have to do it, and that's moral courage right there to put it out there.
Liz, can I follow up with that? So just so people understand, if you have a green card, are you an American permanent resident?
My understanding is yes.
Okay, so anybody with a green card should basically have if they get taken, should have sort of the same, you're advocating for, they should have the same essential rights that somebody who is a full US citizen would, in terms of the government's response.
Well, the US, we would say yes. So US nationals are covered by the Levinson Act. And we know it can get tricky at times, to the point you made earlier, Peter, that captor countries don't necessarily, we have trouble getting them to recognize dual citizenship. We hear from the government that getting other countries to understand the idea of like a legal permanent residence is additionally challenging. But that shouldn't stop the US government from sending the signal that this person is an American, this person is valuable to us, and we want that individual back. I mean, Mickey, thank you so much for raising those two issues, because those are, keeping this space nonpartisan is something we do hear from families, as well as, and Peter, thank you for raising this question again, the idea of like, who is an American? We do hear that at times from families and those concerns, and I think it brings into the idea of like, we sometimes hear families wonder, like, am I American enough? And we want to reassure everyone that yes, and we really need the US government to send that strong message that yes, by working to bring everyone home.
Alexandra, I want to ask you a question about deterrence. I mean, one form of deterrence is post facto, which is, have you ever considered suing the Taliban?
We had that thought in mind, but now the Taliban is not officially recognized. Just
it doesn't. I don't think it really matters, to be honest. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but a civil suit against a group that that it has assets is, there's no reason why. To me, it seems to me, it's actually harder to sue a government than it is to sue. I'm not a lawyer, but since we're talking about deterrence, it seems that, there are various forms. There's a drone strike. There's a court proceeding in the United States, which Diane Foley was able to kind of to get justice for Jim, but that happens very rarely. Some form of UN sanctions on particular people for engaging in these crimes, so they can't travel. I mean, and also civil suits, which, maybe you don't get recovery for a long time or whatever, but it's at least something.
Absolutely. We will consider that avenue. We've been really busy after George's release, mostly addressing his medical issues. He went through a surgery recently because he came back from Afghanistan with cancer. So we were really lucky to discover it on time. I would not really say on time. The cancer kind of began to spread, but we were really lucky that they operated on him. Now that he's doing better physically, we may consider this option as well. But yeah, that wasn't George's mind when he came out.
And Peter, you're absolutely right. The time to do deterrence is when our people are back, and we typically fail at that because we celebrate their return and then we move on. And civil suits against captors, even if it's really hard to recover the funds, there are mechanisms, there are individuals that do that really, really well. First, it takes care of the families, but it also sends a message of deterrence. I would love to see more institutional governmental moves, including legally, on this, not only broad sanctions against countries that are already sanctioned, but individual sanctions and restrictions and red notices. So some of these officials who are responsible directly for the hurting of Americans are limited. And if we need to pick some of them to bring them to justice in the United States, that will send a really strong deterrence message. But again, that's very complicated because of these countries and the international binational interest that we have with them.
Great. I thank you to our panelists. Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you, Mickey. Thank you, Alexandra. We're going to turn it back to Benjamin.
Sure, I'm just going to come over with a voiceover for a minute. We do have the opportunity, we have a few minutes as well, for those who are attending the webinar to post questions in the Q&A chat feature. So if you go to the top of your screen where you're viewing the webinar, you should see a button that says Q&A. And if you click there, you should have the opportunity to submit a question that you would like to have asked or present to the panelists. So that could be for any one of them. So I don't see anything that's been shared yet as a question. So we'll give it maybe just a couple of minutes for folks to submit anything that might be on their minds. And for those who are doing that, I'll publish the questions that come in. Please do upvote anything that you also have the same sort of questions. We kind of get a sense from the room where some of the most burning questions are, I feel like. Okay, I'm going to publish one here from Pavel Butorin. Peter, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm happy to read it out if it'd be helpful.
Go ahead, because I can't see it.
Okay, sure. So Pavel asks, it's great to see everyone here today, and an immense thank you to the Foley Foundation for this report, for this conversation. More than 1 year after my wife Alsu's rescue from wrongful imprisonment in Russia, I still have not received any coherent answer from former or current government officials as to why Alsu, an American citizen who was arrested clearly because of her citizenship, was not designated wrongfully detained until shortly before her prisoner swap. Alsu met all of the criteria, and I am indeed grateful to the Biden administration for bringing Alsu back, but I simply cannot forget those numerous meetings with State Department officials where I was consistently told the designation didn't matter, to which I said, why do we have the Levinson Act then? I guess it's more of a comment than a question. So maybe if anyone else would like to jump onto that was Pavel's question / comment.
Can I suggest an answer, and Liz or Mickey, please tell me if I'm wrong, because we actually did this last year, as I recall, with Pavel as part of the panel, and my impression, and without direct knowledge, was that if his wife had been formally designated as wrongfully detained, it might have complicated her release, which happened very shortly thereafter. That may not be a perfect answer, or even the right answer, but Liz, what is your view?
Like Pavel, we don't know. One of the recommendations that we do put forward would be the idea of like a private designation, because the family is still, when you're designated, that comes with things. To Alexandra's point, it's expensive to travel to Washington, D.C., where all these people, lawmakers and state have their seat of power. Designation allows for like travel up to 2 times a year that the U.S. government will help pay for. It helps, it promises you that when your loved one returns, they're going to get the post-isolation support activities services, and that up to 5 years after their return, you're going to get the medical and mental health reimbursements. We prefer a more direct model, but they'll be the services for them. So why not do something like a private designation if there's concerns that the captor country would use a designation against them, to make sure the families gain the care, and that their families also gain that. There was one, I know we put a lot of quotes in this report, there was one we didn't use that I really loved from a subject matter expert who said, I believe the US government doesn't understand how much a wrongful detention designation lets a family know that they are being seen.
Thank you.
The private designation.
I'm not seeing any other questions yet posted, so we'll give it maybe a couple of minutes here in case others do have a question before we transition to the.
And Benjamin, as we wait for another question, if there is one, and Pavel, I'm glad that Alsu is back and you guys are doing so well. It's great. As I talked about before earlier in this conversation, I worry about the designations, not because I don't think they're important, they're very important. I worry of what happens when somebody doesn't meet the threshold and what it means to the families, and therefore the constant pursuit of defining exactly where the line is it can be problematic. The intention, as Liz said really well in her report, is to make these criteria and the extension of the totality of circumstances to be inclusive or extending, so we can, if it doesn't necessarily fit, we can still include somebody, but in practice, it's being used exactly the opposite. That if you meet the criteria, that totality of circumstances is used as a way to say, yeah, but the totality of circumstances don't add up, so we don't designate. And that allows for policy considerations to take precedent over the individuals that need to be returned. And that is exactly, I believe, at the heart of Liz's, through the thread of her recommendations and findings in this report. That's the thing that we have to address overall. Again, I have to put an asterisk in this. The current administration is paying less attention to it in the way that they're conducting in a positive way, because they're bringing people home. However, the funding that are associated with the designation, it has real impact on the families and the returnee during their captivity and after the captivity. And I believe that some of the times the reason for not designating is financial, because of the burdens and responsibilities that are being held. So we need to fix this. And I will say one last thing on this. I know we talk about trying to refine and overdo the legislation. Congressional oversight. Congress passed the law. The law was passed with a certain intention, and Congress has the responsibility and the right to oversee the way the executive implements it. That we need to lean on Congress to exercise their responsibility and right to oversee it. And as Liz said, if this is handled in a discrete classified briefings, that is absolutely fine. But it needs to happen, because that's when legislation starts to get off the rails of the intention by which it was made.
Thank you, Mickey. Not seeing any additional questions submitted, so I think at this point we'll transition to the next segment.
I see one from David, right?
Oh, sorry, I just saw it now. Great. Thank you for pointing that out, Liz. All right, let me publish this one so others can see it. So David Ewald asks, thank you for such a great event and report. I'm curious what, if any, role the general public might play in helping support families, advocating for prisoners, encouraging representatives to take action, etc. Liz, maybe do you have a thought to start us off?
Towards the start of the report, we include a letter from the campaign Bring Our Families Home, which is a family-led campaign. Sorry, that's where my mind immediately went, like learning the names of people who are being held and helping share their stories. I think we had this question come up at a film fest event earlier this year, and some of the ideas shared was like just following these social media accounts, sharing their stories, and when appropriate, when there's bills or legislation up, calling your own representatives in Congress and pushing them to that action as well. Really, a lot of times we talk about trying to make sure we're building the political resolve so leaders can make those tough decisions needed to bring people home. But I'd be interested in Mickey and Alexandra's thoughts as well.
I didn't even I was thinking if I should even mention this example, because it's embarrassing to me, even though it's not my fault. But when George went missing and I called my representative's office in Atlanta, I was basically told by her clerk to hang up and call 911. even though my husband was missing in Afghanistan. So I was so shocked that initial encounter that I had with my representative's office was terrible. I was already feeling isolated, and I was already feeling that there is no support from the government, but that was just, that was terrible. And it took me months. And, Hostage US here, they can confirm, because they were helping me actually to contact my representative's office and do it the proper way. Because I just would not be able to even explain them why they should be helping me, because, George is from Atlanta, he was working for Delta, and our representative should have stepped in and actually helped us not only navigate, but should help advocating for us. So it took us months before we got any support from our representative's office. In the end, it was helpful after, let's say, about a year after our representative was able to speak on our behalf, and, really advocate for us, especially every time I needed to get a meeting with NSA, this kind of cases. However, I think that it is really important to involve your representatives right away and kind of keep them accountable too, because, they have to help.
If I can respond to that too, first of all, David Awald is not just an innocent bystander, the guy who asked the question. For those who don't know him, he's the designer that helped 50 families, work with 50 families, design the flag of the wrongful detention, and hostage is the one that is just behind me here. But David, to your question, I think there is a role for the general public and individuals in this, several things. The first one, in helping in advocacy for this, we need those names of those that are being held to become a household name. And yes, a lot of it is media and how we put them in the media, but guess what? The media responds to what the public indicates is of interest. We need people to use their own social media, to own things, to learn their stories, to say their names, and to combat, and that's really important, any narrative put together by the captors, because so often we are fighting, there are innocent Americans being held, but of course they're captors claiming that they did X, Y, and Z, and some of our own public buys into that. Oh, if they did that, why should we help them? Well, hold off. Who are you believing here? And listen to the families, hear their stories, and repeat those to make sure that there's attention, because at the end of the day, that's what decision makers are going to pay attention to. We have several examples of that in the past. Write op-eds, write letters. It helps craft the narratives and help get people home. And just this year, we had like families that came home because of things like that. So that's number one. The second one, take responsibility of your own action. Please, please, please. It's a part of the deterrence part. We're seeing a trend that is happening now. We're seeing adventure tourism increasing in places like Afghanistan. We see adventure tourism increasing in places like Iran. People are going too far. It's not intentional. It's not bad people, but it's taking risks in areas that then we all have to jump in and help. And we see a lot of Americans with authorized, licensed drugs traveling around, not understanding that even if it's legal for you in the United States to use it for medical reasons, it is absolutely a death sentence or a life sentence in a lot of countries in the world. You can clean your cartridges, they will find residue. You will be accused of trafficking, and even if we're able to get you out, it takes a long time. We need to have a public awareness of these kind of trends that are happening. And last trend that is happening to be aware of, we have warning of travels on the State Department website and alerts on different countries. We need to expand that and understand that it's not only the countries, but the countries in proximity to those countries, because we have increasing a number of Americans that are not traveling to those problematic countries, but are nearing the border and are being grabbed, either forcefully or seduced in there, and then once they cross the border, it's game over. So we need to have public service announcements. We need to have awareness of these kind of trends, and for Americans to be a little bit more careful. It will help us mitigate this problem.
We've got one last question. Thank you, Mickey, for chiming in on that. That I want to cover. We're running short on time though, so we'll have to make the sort of responses quick if we could. This one comes from Amy Manson, who's a leader with Hostage US, partner NGO. She says, to Alexandra's point, the variation in treatment of US born, put in quotes, versus also in quotes, US acquired citizenship is real. We hear it in the rhetoric of many. Could an effort to lead by example so that the language of all stakeholders includes LPR, which includes green card holders, to help educate the public and officials? Maybe I'll start with Liz. Do you have a thought on how we could make sure that language is out there in the public consistently, that it's not just by default people are thinking about US citizens?
One example I default to, I know that New York Times, I want to say last month, ran an article on Americans being held in Iran, but it initially focused just on like US citizens. I can't remember if we were asked to respond to it or not. I do remember like sharing again that we count US nationals and we were counting more US nationals held in Iran. So I think just finding those opportunities and making sure people are tracking the wider problem.
Any other final thoughts from other participants or other panelists? Okay, great. I do see in the chat that some folks were having trouble getting into the Q&A. I apologize for that. Unfortunately, I tested this out myself, and unless it's like Chrome or Edge, the feature doesn't work on all browsers. So appreciate your understanding of that. I want to thank our moderator, Peter Bergen. Thank you so much for guiding us through this conversation. Liz, thank you for continuing to walk us through the report and its implications, the questions. Alexandra, we're so happy that George is back and is recovering. It's so great for you to participate and just share your perspective, the family's perspective on these challenges, because hearing directly from families, there's no substitute for truly understanding the pain and trials that you and George and the rest of your family have gone through. So we thank you for that. And Mickey, thank you for your partnership and all that you do in terms of helping to actively bring Americans home who are find themselves in these situations, and to be such a good partner, as we all should be, with the government to help make these things, make these cases reach a resolution. Thank you, everyone. We're going to transition to the next segment, which is to share some remarks from members of Congress who have shared those with us. While we queue up the video that includes the vast majority of the remarks, we do have written remarks that were shared by Chairman Jim Risch, Chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We'll hear from other members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the video, but Chairman Risch has shared the following, which I will read out. Thank you for inviting me to give remarks today, and I apologize I'm not able to be with you. Since January, we have seen a remarkable and steady return of wrongfully detained Americans held abroad. No one deserves to be held in prison for no legitimate reason, let alone by themselves in a foreign country. Bringing Americans home is a bipartisan issue that I've been proud to champion with Senator Coons and Ranking Member Shaheen. Between the three of us, we have authored and passed several initiatives to give SPIHA, the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, additional resources, help families of those wrongfully detained, deter adversary regimes from harming our citizens, and to name and shame those who partake in this awful practice. I was pleased to see President Trump sign our Countering Wrongful Detention Act into an executive order, and will continue working to codify it here in the Senate. One of the key responsibilities of our government is to ensure Americans are safe at home and abroad, and I am working every day to ensure that those who take Americans hostage pay the price. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to working with you all to bring every American wrongfully detained abroad home. That concludes the chairman's remarks.
Hello, I'm Senator Jean Shaheen. For more than a decade, it has been my privilege to support the Foley Foundation's work on behalf of wrongfully detained Americans and journalists. I've seen firsthand the Foundation's extraordinary efforts to free hostages and to support their families, a true testament to the tireless leadership of Diane Foley. Unfortunately, our adversaries continue to use American citizens as pawns to advance their goals. That demands the strongest response. In Congress, we're working closely with the Foley Foundation to strengthen the resources and support systems needed to help victims and their families. America's adversaries don't care if their captives are Democrats or Republicans, only that they're Americans. Our response must be nonpartisan as well. That's why I welcome the Trump administration's recent announcement to expand sanctions and visa restrictions on those engaged in hostage-taking, building on the work of the previous administration. I agree with Diane Foley. This new authority should be used quickly to send a strong signal. If we stand united, government, advocates, and families, we can bring every captive home and make hostage-taking a strategy that fails. Thank you to the Foley Foundation for leading this fight. Together, we will finish the work of bringing Americans home.
To the James Foley Foundation, thank you for all you do to ensure that Americans detained or held hostage overseas are known, are recovered, are returned. I am so grateful for my partnership with Senator Jim Risch of Idaho as we have worked to advance legislation that'll make sure that we counter the use of hostage-taking by other countries around the world. And I'm encouraged that President Trump has just signed an executive order putting into place some of the efforts that Senator Risch and I have been working on with you for years. We have so much more to do together, but this is a great day for all of us who wait, who pray, who worry about Americans wrongfully held and detained overseas, and I look forward to continuing this urgent work with all of you.
Good afternoon. 10 years ago, the United States established the Hostage Recovery Enterprise to bring home Americans seized abroad. Since then, more than 170 Americans have been restored to their families and to their country. Each of those returns represents lives restored, families reunited, and hope renewed. In 2020, Congress strengthened this effort by passing the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Accountability Act, ensuring that the enterprise would endure as a permanent commitment of our nation. But we know the work is far from finished. The seizing of hostages by states and terrorists is the height of debasement and cruelty, meant to put citizens and governments in utterly impossible situations. The regimes which use hostages as a tool of statecraft have for thousands of years been considered outside the bounds of civilization. The good work that the Foley Foundation does is hopelessly complicated and deeply compassionate. Your advocacy and leadership keep these families from being forgotten. You give them a voice, and you help in ways material and immaterial to secure the release of those in captivity. Thank you for your good work, and God bless you.
Hi, this is Congressman French Hill from Arkansas's 2nd Congressional District. I'm so sorry I couldn't join you at today's Bringing Americans Home event. As co-chair of the Congressional Hostage Task Force, I remain deeply committed to bringing Americans home and ensuring their smooth transition back into daily life. Events like this keep attention on this critical mission. When Americans are wrongfully detained abroad, it's not just a personal tragedy, it's an attack on our nation. Over the last decade, we've seen too many heartbreaking cases. Paul Whelan's years in a Russian prison, Ryan Corbett's nightmare and inhumane confinement in Afghanistan, Americans brutalized by Hamas, and of course, James Foley's barbaric murder by ISIS in 2014. These stories remind us why Congress must act decisively. In this Congress, I've introduced bipartisan solutions: the Stop Tax Penalties on American Hostages Act and the Countering Wrongful Detention Act of 2025. These will ease the burden on Americans returning home and deter and punish those who target our citizens. You know my commitment. I will keep working until every American is returned home. Thank you to my friend Diane Foley and the Foley Foundation for your tireless advocacy, your groundbreaking reporting, and for inspiring all of us who are committed to bringing every one of our Americans home.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Haley Stevens, and I'm so deeply honored to be speaking to all of you at the annual Foley Foundation event and the research rollout of bringing hostages home. Alongside my colleague French Hill, a congressman from Arkansas, we work together on bipartisan issues for hostages and Americans wrongfully detained abroad. And our work is strong because of organizations like the Foley Foundation. I want to especially thank my friend Diane Foley for her tireless advocacy and efforts on behalf of this issue in memory of her son and alongside so many families as we move forward. While we have seen some progress in terms of hostages and Americans wrongfully detained abroad coming home, we need to continue to shine a light on what leads to these instances, what happens when individuals come home, and frankly, what happens for the families when they do not. This is a very serious issue because Americans are being targeted abroad. And before organizations like the Foley Foundation were created and before our task force in the Congress, a lot of times people were feeling their way around in the dark, trying to bring a loved one home, trying to bring justice, trying to bring attention. And what we've always strived for is a coordination of federal resources and with government agencies working closely together. I'm proud of some of the legislative accomplishments that we've achieved in terms of a day of recognition on March 9th for hostages and Americans wrongfully detained abroad. I'm proud of the resources that we've been able to coordinate, and I am more motivated than ever to continue to work alongside hostage families and survivors going forward. So thank you, Foley Foundation. Your research makes such a difference. Your advocacy matters so very much, and we are going to continue to link arms to do good work and to minimize American hostage taking going forward. Thank you so very much for having me, and I look forward to many years of partnership going forward.
Chairman Brian Mast here. I just want to say that it is an honor to stand with you today and recognize the life-saving work of James W. Foley Foundation. Every single day, you fight for Americans wrongfully held abroad, and you embody our nation's response. We don't leave our people behind. That was my commitment as a service member. We don't leave our men behind. Most Americans will never know the nightmare of having a loved one taken hostage overseas. And thank God, the Foley family lived that tragedy firsthand, and instead of giving up, they turned their heartbreak into a mission. It's a relentless fight to bring every American home so no other family has to suffer like they did. I want to commend the Foley Foundation. I want to commend you for your courage, your determination, your results. You are pushing for a real change that is needed. You remind us all that if an American is held abroad, there should be every expectation that there is an American coming to get them. Whether that's an American with a diplomatic badge or an American with a rifle, one way or another, they are coming home. I know President Trump shares this commitment and has proved it, bringing Mark Fogel home after 14 years in Russia, bringing Eden Alexander home after 19 months in the hands of Hamas terrorists. I know that for the next 4 years, with President Trump's leadership and groups like the Foley Foundation, we will bring even more of our fellow Americans home from their captivity abroad.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. We do appreciate your attention to this important issue. The report that Liz has produced is live on our website, so please do spend some time with it, share it with others who care about this issue so that we can generate greater awareness. We ask that you consider following us on social media, so that would include X, Threads, Facebook, or LinkedIn. And finally, just a concluding note of thanks to all of our presenters, to Peter Bergen, to Alexandra Glesman, and to Mickey Bergman, who have been with us today to help illuminate these issues even further. And it would be remiss if I didn't also pitch our Foley Freedom Run, which is coming up next month, October 18th in New Hampshire and October 25th in Washington, D.C., although anyone can participate from anywhere in the world as a virtual runner. So we encourage you to go to foleyrun.org as a way to support the Foley Foundation and our mission to bring Americans home. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you soon.